All right. See, I'm going to get going here. We want to have you all do an exercise. As I said, some others will come in a little bit as we go, but they'll catch up. This session's on using our Mid-Atlantic vegetable recommendations, production recommendations. As you can see here, there's one at everyone's chair. This is a collaborative effort of 5 states, including Pennsylvania, New Jersey, West Virginia, Maryland, 6 states, Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. Our specialists working with vegetable crops work on this guide, and we have both general and crop-specific information. The guide went through a major change starting after 2015. We went to a Mid-Atlantic guide and a major formatting change in 2018 to the guide that you see now. We have contributors from each state, all that information, and you can start flipping through the guide as we go through today, and you'll see this information. More critically, for you in each of the states, we have information on who the contact people are in your state for different areas working with vegetables, as well as the diagnostic labs. Okay, starting on Section A, so keep flipping through until you get to Section A. And you'll notice this is a lot of general production recommendations. There are 13 sections. You can see the different sections in here. Just want to point out some of the sections that have significant information in them. We have the transplant production, is a very good section. That's on page 3. And then high tunnels has a nice section since that's becoming more and more of an area in our region. We had this talk about wildlife earlier on deer. We have a big wildlife damage section. Has everything from bears to groundhogs in it. But it has a good section on deer. Pollination, again, some really good information on pollination. And then a really good section on food safety concerns. And then you can see all the other sections. Some of them are very small, like the greenhouse section. We do not do greenhouse production in this guide. We just refer you to where you can find information. Go to page 31, you get into the soil and nutrient management section. Here we have information on liming, including the lime requirements. In section 3, B3, goes into soil testing and nutrient recommendations. In section B4, we have information on your nutrient sources, as well as boron recommendations, which is very important for vegetable crops. Going into section C, which is on page 49, we're into the irrigation management section. This section will be undergoing a major revision. So I had our irrigation engineer, James Atkins, go over this, so we'll have a lot more information that's on this upcoming guide. But we have basic principles. We have a really good section on drip irrigation. Some of the tables are going to change, so we'll have some tables that make it easier to use this for the new edition. But it includes irrigation scheduling, using sensors. It includes maintenance of drip irrigation, which we had to use this year at the research station, unfortunately. And then a good section on fertigation and how to calculate fertigation rates. Section D is pesticide safety, so lots and lots of information on different areas of pesticide safety. You go into the last table, I think it's on page 74, is the giant table that has all the information on toxicities. So it lists all the chemicals in the book and their toxicities. This is also undergoing major revision, and will be, you'll see changes to that in the next book. And then E is the pest management sections, which are other speakers will talk about today. And then section F is each of the commodities. We do group together some commodities that are closely related, such as the coal crops, beans, greens. Some sections have multiple crops, but they're closely related. Others are single crops. There's some additional resources in the back of the book, including something like frequently used weights and measures, just general resources. And then if you're looking for a specific table, like I like using the weed table that lists what weeds are controlled with a herbicide, you can look and find it where it says list of tables and figures, where if you can't, if you keep flipping through the book, this is a good index to find it. Information on pesticide use, particularly that, remember, when this is printed, doesn't mean the label's going to be the change. Those labels will be the same. So the labels often change. The label you want to refer to, even if it's recommended in a book, refer back to your label. Our specialists will talk to you more about that. I work on our general crop recommendations or production recommendations, what we call the horticultural sections. And so that will be the first thing in each of the F sections. So turn to your first F section, which is asparagus. And we gather information from trials throughout the region where we look at the variety trials. About 12 of us who are doing variety trials in the region, we split the information up according to who has the most recent information. So here are some trials that we've done recently. So in this, you'll see, let's see if I get there. So up on the top of the of a recommendation list, you can switch to the bean section now. You can see that we're going to have a table, and we're trying to develop tables for each one of these. Not all of them are in this form yet, but we're trying to get there, where we list the type of crops, in this case round potted beans, variety, and then information about, general information about characteristics. So in this case we have color, length, sieve size, use, and then we'll usually have a maturity. And then we'll have other information to help you choose the variety. Particularly in this case, beans, we have 7 different diseases that breeders breed to, and we pull that information off of the charts, off of the information provided to us by the seed companies. Here's another one looking at broccoli. In this case, we have some environmental recommendations, so whether or not it's heat tolerant or cold tolerant, some physiological disorders like hollow stem. So depending on the crop, we'll have different things in those variety recommendations. The next thing that we'll have, this happens to be on the tomato section. I don't mean you have to flip so much, but just to let you know, this is where it's coming from. But in our recommendations, we're going to have a nitrogen recommendation, and it always starts with a total, and then where we would be using the next application. So in this case, we're not putting in any pre-plant broadcast, but we are incorporating into the plant bed, and then we're fertigating throughout the season. For bare ground, you can see we have some up ahead of time, broadcast and disc in, and then side dress. We'll have phosphorus and potassium according to what your soil test results are. And we'll have information on boron and oftentimes sulfur down on the bottom. So you want to read those notes in the bottom. And one of the things to note, just like your label recommendations, your state's your nutrient management plan or the state guidelines supersede what we have in this book. Although most states use these guidelines, whoever's developing your nutrient management plan according to your state's guidelines, you're supposed to follow that before you use these.
Very quick question.
Yeah.
Yeah, one fertigation, like on tomatoes.
Mm-hmm.
Is it different? Is this chart here just for out in the field, or is this for fertigation as well? I'm just kind of wondering about phosphorus.
Yeah. Well, here, if you, glad you said that. We do have fertigation charts for most of our plasticulture crops. So this is a fertigation chart. We do not recommend running in phosphorus through the drip for tomatoes. The reason is because of water quality issues and precipitation out, particularly as you get into some of our areas in the region have water quality that will just clog up your irrigation. If you're not in one of those areas, you could certainly fertigate some phosphorus there.
Even on ones that are under plastic?
Yeah. Yeah, no, like if you're down the eastern shore of Virginia, you'll plug up the emitters with phosphorus because the water quality's, precipitate out. But we do have fertigation charts on some crops where we're looking at nitrogen, potassium, and then we'll have plant tissue test values for the critical growth stage. I had all growth stages in the past. We moved that out because it's a little too much for the book, but we show you where to find that University of Florida site. All of our horticultural sections will have planting information on plant production, critical temperatures, planting dates, planting methods, and spacings. And we'll also have a harvest and post-harvest handling section. So that's when to harvest, handling, cooling, and storage temperature and humidity. And then in some of our sections, we may have different information according to the crop. We will oftentimes have a little information on irrigation, fertigation, mulching, staking, stringing, pruning in case of tomatoes. We have pollination sections on those crops that need pollination from insects. We'll have harvest sizes and classifications like in the tomato section. We'll have information on grafting. We have that in our tomato section. We've added that into our watermelon section coming up. Special production issues, for example, in the cucumber section, we have information on trellising. In the bean section, we have information on growing pole beans for smaller growers. And then on those crops that have a lot of disorders, physiological disorders like potatoes, such as tomatoes, and our cole crops, we have information on those disorders. Mark?
All right. Good Lord. There we go. All right. I'm Mark VanGessel. I'm the Extension Weed Specialist and have been involved in this publication for over 20-some years. This, as Gordon said, this is a long history of this publication, and a lot of information we have in there, particularly on some of the use patterns and so on, date back to when Henry Wilson was a young weed scientist. So there's a lot of history and a lot of information that goes into here. The title of the publication, if you look on the cover, says Mid-Atlantic Commercial Vegetable Production Recommendations. When it comes to the pest management side, specifically for the weed science side, we take commercial and recommendations very seriously. We don't necessarily include every herbicide in the book because we don't have experience with it. We wouldn't necessarily recommend it because we're not always aware of it. So there are some products that might be labeled that we don't have in the book just because we don't have the experience with them. The book also doesn't have much in the way of weed identification. So if you haven't identified which weeds you have in the field, it's really hard to match up which is the best management strategy. So while these aren't in the book, we have some very good extension publications. These are all online, free downloads. They're on your on the handout there for identification. Another really good one is the Weeds of the Northeast, which you can buy online for a used copy for about 13 to 15 bucks. The weeds portion of it, as Gordon mentioned early on in the book, there's the section D, which covers pesticide safety. There's tables on toxicity, dermal and oral toxicity. We have in the first section, we have tables on relative herbicide effectiveness, crop rotation. Which of these herbicides do you have to be aware of in terms of rotation for the next year? We also have a table on prepackaged mixes. You use a product like Strategy. It's got 2 active ingredients in there. What's actually in that premix? That's in the beginning of the publication in table E4. And then in this latest revision, when it comes to a lot of the pest management side, it's been reorganized based on risk management. and pesticide resistance. And so we really have incorporated pesticide group numbers to help make people aware of what pesticides they're using and making sure they rotate and avoid high-risk pesticides as much as possible. Each of the commodity sections, we start off with the weed science part of it. In those crops that have a pesticide plastic culture, we included this table talking about whether it's labeled for under the plastic or bare ground. We refer back to table E-2, which is our relative effectiveness table. So in the case of peppers, you've got products you can use under the plastic. And you know you've got foxtail as a problem. Here's your options, and here's the ones that are rated very good or a relative rating on effectiveness. So you've got to kind of switch back and forth a little bit between the products that are labeled and those as this table in terms of its effectiveness. For each of the products, we break them out by application, almost in terms of chronology. We start off with burn downs, then we talk about soil applied herbicides, post-emergence herbicides, post-harvest, other labeled herbicides. These are things that might be labeled. We don't have any local experience with it. We include it in the book, but just have a table that it's labeled. We don't have any information as far as rates or comments on it, just because we don't have experience with it. Also, under each herbicide, we list the rates. Note that these rates may vary by state. They're not uniform throughout the region. We talk about pre-harvest intervals and re-entry intervals. And then we have specific comments on individual herbicides based on our experiences, whether it's 24C. If it is, it may have an expiration date, the local use experience, and the maximum rates allowed. It's a nutshell of the weed science section.
Thanks, Mark. All right, so I'm David Owens with the University of Delaware Extension Entomology. I like to spray a lot of insecticides and call myself an entomologist. The insect portions of the guide are I feel like there's a common behavior of using them like a label, and that everyone flips to what pest they want to kill and how much to go out on an acre. And it's really easy to gloss over, just on a label, some important front matter. So I'm going to pick on Agromech's label here real quick. Agromech in the small text says to avoid illegal residues, it must be mixed with a spray adjuvant. Similarly, in our insect chapters, we've got front matter. Generally, we only list products that we expect to work well. We don't have a lot of the generics in there, and some of the brands are not in, either because they have suppression listed on the label, or they're outdated. Vidate is a good example of that. None of us recommend Vidate anymore except for on a couple of situations. Or oversight. We do have notes on individual pests in some chapters for resistance, especially with the worms. We have notes on thresholds for a few pests, as well as application equipment setups. So in the cold crops for worms, there's a line here, apply spray with 3 nozzles per row, and that's to get really good coverage. A couple of years ago, we reorganized the pyrethroid and neonicotinoids in the book. We were encouraged to save on space, and so we pulled them all out of the individual insect section and put them in a larger table at the end. Not every crop in a specific section is labeled for that particular pyrethroid or neonicotinoid. So for cold crops, we'll have Some of them are labeled specifically for Brussels sprouts, but not for broccoli. So that the book does not take the place of the label. You still need to refer back to that label. We also have combination products. Just keep in mind for some of these combo products that in many cases only one part of that combination is active on a particular pest, but maybe the other part of that combo product picks up a different pest that is also present in your crop. Quick word on generics. Generally, they're not in the guide. Our sister publication for the Southeast will have lists of generics. It just is a ton of work to go through all the labels. So for imidacloprid, the active ingredient, these are all the generics that have imidacloprid in them. This is the brand name right here, Admire and Admire Pro, and then you've got close to a dozen generics formulated by different companies. The formulations can be different. So this here is abamectin with emulsifiable concentrate. This is abamectin brand name suspended concentrate. That will influence your mixing, and it will influence tank mix compatibility. Also, when going out by the pounds of active ingredient per gallon and then the use rates, sometimes these generics put out different active ingredient amounts per acre. What else is in the guide? Insecticide resistance and modes of action groups. This is particularly important if you're targeting a pest multiple times. You don't want to hit that with the same mode of action group over and over again. We've got crop restrictions, like I said. Also, we've got an indication of restricted use and bee toxicity. This is really important for those crops that are highly attractive to bees or you need bees to work for pollination. In section E, before the individual crop sections, we've got some text on how to improve pest management, equipment, calibration, factors that influence compatibility. Carrie Richards will be speaking on some of these factors a little bit later on today, downstairs. In section D, pesticide safety, there is a blurb on notification of beekeepers. In Delaware, we have about 6,000 beehives in the state for pollination, or for, in my case, hobby colonies. So just good neighborly relationships. Make sure that you inform beekeepers before you spray a crop with a product that is very sensitive for bees. And finally, in section D, we've got this enormous table that lists toxicity, LD50s, toxicity to birds, to bees. I had a question last year, what pyrethroid should I use that will be less irritating to my workers? This table can help answer that question.
I think that's me? Yep. Good segue. Okay, so I'm Kate Everts. I'm the extension plant pathologist for University of Maryland that works on vegetables. And so we also, as a group, get together, all the vegetable extension plant pathologists in the 5 or 6 surrounding states in the Mid-Atlantic and work on our disease sections. And we organize them a little bit differently, in part just because diseases can behave a little bit differently. So I think we have a lot of information on cultural practices. It's kind of interspersed throughout, and I'll show you some places where that is. Because in a lot of cases, the chemicals alone just won't cut it. You have to have a more integrated kind of approach. As David just said, there's this big section in D. I think this is exactly the same table he showed in the last slide. But I just want to point out that there are some products, fungicides, that have toxicity to bees. So just because you're using a fungicide, don't assume that it's going to be safe for bees. So make sure you take a look at that table as well. So that's in Section D. In Section E, we have a lot of information. There's a nematode section that talks about how to sample your fields. It goes over chemical management strategies, and then in each commodity section, in Section, is that Section F, there'll be specific information on what's labeled. But in Section E, there's general information on how to approach nematode management. And again, non-chemical management strategies, because they can be, in some situations, they can be effective, or you really need to do them in combination with whatever chemical you use. There's, we also have a table of fungicide resistance management. It's got one cover page right before it that has really good information just about the different fungicide classes. And then within that table, which is probably around 120 or something like that, it talks about fungicide resistance. And you can see kind of in a nutshell how, you know, how different fungicides fall out in terms of their fungicide class. And then one section that I think is pretty useful that we added this probably about 5 years ago, is this disease control in the greenhouse. And, you know, as we started to get more and more high tunnel and greenhouse growers, we decided to add this. It's really made, I want to make a point, it's really made for greenhouse production. So if you have a structure that's heated, that's classified as a greenhouse, that's the kind of products that are in here. I actually don't mind recommending them for people who have high tunnels. I know that there's different requirements or different kind of laws or regulations in different states about high tunnel production, and they're not as stringent as greenhouse production, but I still feel like if your workers or you are in this kind of closed space, it's probably good to be using these products. And we did try to organize it again this year to highlight more intensively what products can be used in organic production. So before we had that information in there, now we tried to highlight it. So that'll be in the 2020 edition. You can't see it in this one. That's brand new. But the table is still in there, and you can see that. One thing I want to say before I go on, too, is we do our best to have accurate information in here, and we try to recheck all the labels all the time. But you can imagine there's a lot of labels and a lot of different uses, so you know how complicated and how long a label can be. We can miss things. So if you ever notice something, it would not hurt anyone's feeling to bring that information to their attention. So, every 4 or 5 years I'll have somebody say, in the guide it says this can be used on this disease, but that's not really on the label. So, don't be afraid to say that. And that's also one of the reasons why we say the label really is the law. You have to, look at the guide. It's a guide. It will help you pick your products, but make sure you go to the label and double check. Okay, so then the commodity section, Section F, we have a lot of information about diseases there too. We have, I think Gordon showed this, but we have the resistant or the diseases that a cultivar might have. So this is powdery mildew resistant, et cetera, powdery mildew tolerant. So there are a lot of great information there, and host resistance in that section. We also will have information if there's, so we have some diseases that don't overwinter here, and so it's real critical to not just assume you need to spray and waste your money and your time and your labor. So if there's a disease like that, so for example, downy mildew on cucurbits would be like that, we include this information on where to get current data in season about where that disease might be in relation to where your farm is. We have fungicide resistance recommendations in our tables. So this probably is a little different from the other, from the insects and weeds also. We'll try to recommend like what the better products might be, and then alternated with an alternation with something else. And so we'll put the, what we feel are the strongest products at the top in some of our sections, and then say alternate this with, And then you need to look at the resistance, the fungicide resistance codes, and make sure that you're appropriately alternating products. And then the other thing too, as I mentioned, we do put cultural practice information, especially we try to do it where we don't have a good chemical. So there's some diseases, there's just no good chemistry out there, or because of the life cycle of the disease, it's just not efficient to try to control it with a fungicide. So, you know, especially in those cases, but even where there are fungicides available, we'll try to put in information on cultural practices that can help out. And then I just want to mention some other resources, and that's we've been doing a companion guide. The same people who put together a recommendation guide, we have a companion guide on fungicide resistance that we've had for the last probably 8 years. That's very nice, and we make an effort to include everything in that guide that's in the recommendation guide. So you should be able to go online and find that. I mentioned the Downy Mildew IPM site for in-season information on where that disease is. There's also a site where you can get information on late blight if you have tomatoes or potatoes in your, on your farm. And that will give you in-season information if we're seeing late blight anywhere in the U.S. And it will give you some information about what, if it's a strain that's resistant to Ridamil or not. Okay, I think that's the disease part.
So now we're going to get into an interactive session. So we're going to have you work in groups. If you notice, there's a blue tape on the side of the table. That is your group number. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. And you'll be using that other sheet that we have on your desk, which is the, that one, yeah.
At the top, it says using the Mid-Atlantic Vegetable Recommendations, 2 pages. Flip over to the second page, and it has the scenario.
All right, so what we're going to do is give you some base information, which is provided there in your sheet. So you can read this over. It'll give you the rotation, soil values, and such. And then what you are going to do now is work as a group to go through the questions that are on that sheet. So each group, find out who the oldest is. You're in charge. Youngest, you're going to write down the information to report. All right?